Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. It's amazing to see a full crowd here this morning for our kickoff day of our season here at the Jewish Lifelong Learning Program at Case Western Reserve University. My name is Alana Cooper. I direct Jewish Lifelong Learning here, and I'm so pleased to see all of you, and of course to welcome our speaker, Sam Freedman. Before I introduce him, I'm going to turn this off. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to, first of all, start by thanking the AJC for co-sponsoring this event with us as part of their regular First Thursdays program. And I'm happy to have Lisi Shapiro here with us, who's in the back and offers her greetings to everyone. I also want to tell you about several upcoming events that we have soon here at Siegal. A few courses that we have going on. I'll promote my own first. I start a class next week on Tuesday evening called The Jewish Calendar, Marking the Holidays and Measuring Time. Registration is still open. If you're interested to find out a little bit about the class, grab me afterwards. We also have Jews and Sports starting on Tuesday night. Jews and Sports from the Nazi Olympics to Berlin to the Hall of Fame. I want to draw your attention as well to a special monthly program that we've been running for about a year now in partnership with the Cleveland Jewish News and Cleveland Jewish News Foundation called Tribe Talk New Jewish Conversations. It's an edgy, informative, informal, talk show style conversation that I hold together with my colleague Brian Amkraut, the executive director here, and we have a featured guest every month. And this month, two of the topics that we'll be speaking about, among others, are the Kotel controversy and the aftermath of the events of Charlottesville. I hope that you'll join us for that. And finally, I want to announce our next lecture. First of all, there is a lecture here this evening. We're sold out as well, I'm happy to say. But the lecture that we have coming up after this is on Monday evening, September 11th. We have Professor Matt Goldish from OSU, who will be speaking on the Jewish mystics of Tzfat. And we still do have room available for that. If you're interested in registering, please do so before you leave this morning. With that, I'm going to turn my attention to the topic at hand to welcome our speaker, Samuel Freedman, who's a journalist, a columnist, and a professor. Sam Freedman is the author of 7 acclaimed books, most recently Breaking the Line, the season in black college football that transformed the game and changed the course of civil rights, which came out in 2013. I'm going to list his other books, and I'm going to draw special attention to one in particular. The titles of his other books are Small Victories, The Real World of a Teacher, Her Students, and Their High School, published in 1990. Upon This Rock, The Miracles of a Black Church, published in 1993. The Inheritance, How 3 Families and America Moved from Roosevelt to Reagan and Beyond, which was published in 96. Letters to a Young, Who She Was, My Search for My Mother's Life, published in 2005. Letters to a Young Journalist, published in 2006. And the one that I want to draw particular attention to today is Jew versus Jew, The Struggle for the Soul of American Jewry. Many of the books that I just listed won very prestigious prizes. Jew versus Jew won the National Book Award for Nonfiction in 2001 and made the Publishers Weekly religion bestseller list. Of course, the book is known here in town because of, well, let me just say that the book as a whole, many of us know the particular chapter in the book on Beechwood, but the book as a whole was hailed as a work of rigorous reporting, lucid writing, and intellectual curiosity. And even as it chronicles an embittered and polarized community, it refuses to take sides and to pass judgment, is written instead with compassion and acuity. Jew versus Jew bears witness. And as many of us here know, there's a particular chapter that's set here in Beechwood surrounding a zoning conflict about whether to allow for the development of a campus of several Jewish religious institutions on Green Road. In addition to all of these accomplishments, Sam Freedman was a staff reporter on the New York Times from 1981 through 1997. Until very recently, he wrote the On Religion column there, and also from 2004 to 2008, he wrote the On Education forum. I'll just say one other thing about him. That there's many, many more things I could say, but one other thing about him that I think is so important and really a giving of the spirit of the kind of journalism you do and the teaching that you do is that Sam is a tenured professor at Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism and was named received Columbia University's coveted Presidential Award for Outstanding Teaching. He has a book writing class, and in that class he worked with his students to develop more than develop more than 65 authors, editors, and agents, and really I think speaks to Sam's generosity as a journalist. I myself was privileged to take a week-long seminar with him this spring at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and we're really so happy to have you here, and I hope that you'll give Sam a warm Cleveland welcome.
Thank you so much, Ilana. I thought the Cleveland welcome would include people in the end zone with dog faces on, but can't always have that. But I'm so grateful to Ilana, to Case, to the AJC, to the Federation for allowing me to come here and speak today and to come back to a place that is meaningful for me at multiple levels. The one, obviously, many of you are familiar with is all the reporting I did out in Beechwood for a chapter in Jew versus Jew. And I still have a real deep debt to Cy Waxberger and Dr. David Gottesman, who were especially generous with their experiences with me, and Cynthia Dettelbach, who's then the editor of the Cleveland Jewish News, and one of her great reporters, Marcy Oster, who went on to make Aliyah and now writes for JTA out of Israel, all of whom were incredibly helpful to me in doing that work. I also have a whole history with Case. My uncle Freddie Freedman of blessed memory was a music librarian at Case. For a number of years, my cousins Stuart and Rivy grew up there, and my wonderful, cherished Aunt Jacqueline Freedman still lives in Shaker. I couch surfed with her. Actually, she did give me a bedroom, wasn't couch surfing, but I stayed with her on all of my research trips out here to do the research for Jew versus Jew. And I also want to say that even though as Jews we don't believe in worshiping graven objects, I want to urge you all to go and make a pilgrimage to gate C8 at Hopkins Airport, C8, where you will see a flower-powered guitar. This was one of the guitars that was commissioned by the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and it was, I think, a curated competition for which ones would be displayed. And my aunt, who's had a whole amazing career as an art professor and a fine artist and a book illustrator and many things, designed this guitar with the flower power spirit of the 60s. Now we're 50 years after the Summer of Love, how appropriate. And it's right out there at C8. And And I was out there last night. I hijacked this millennial coming out of the men's room to take a picture of me with it. So, and I also should say that Aunt Jackie has also had a really meaningful, purposeful Jewish life, both with her art, some of the books she's illustrated, and as a member of her shul, and has been an important person in my Jewish life as well. And finally, Ilana, personally, it was a real treasure to be able to work with Ilana and other scholars like her this summer at the University of Michigan. I know firsthand her incredible scholarship about memory and objects and what they call in the academy material culture, everywhere from, Samarkand to some of the, shuls in some of the smaller industrial cities here in Ohio particularly, but also Western Pennsylvania, that have had to decide what gets saved, why do we save it, how do we save it. And I look forward to when I'll be sitting in the audience or introducing her, talking about her book on that topic. So thank you all so much. And, in the old days, which fortunately for you aren't the old days, I'm used to talking to students who, as great as they are at Columbia, barely know what a typewriter is. And by the way, let me go back to one other thing. Two things I have to just update on the introduction. I wish I'd won the National Book Award for Jew versus Jew. It was the National Jewish Book Award, but it still ain't chopped liver, so I'm glad I won that. And I also want to say that the latest count on students for my book class is now 82 of my students have gotten book contracts for the work they did in my class. And the reason I want to call that out is one of my all-time favorites. Does anyone here know the Pitluck family? Yes. The Pitluck family? Adam Pitluck? Okay, Adam Pitluck has written, I think, 4 books. The first came out in my class. Adam is one of my all-time favorite students at Columbia J School. He is a remarkable person, and I don't think I'm telling a tale out of school because I hope he's going to write about it at book length. He's done some at article length when he was the editor of American Way magazine. Adam struggled with, for a long time, undiagnosed dyslexia growing up, and about the time they finally figured out what was going on, that it was dyslexia and not, a lack of work ethic or anything else, it was also the moment he discovered journalism. So here's someone who goes from difficulty reading and writing to making his life as a journalist and a writer. And he has just done incredible work. He's now getting his doctorate in journalism at the University of Oklahoma. And I hope some of his mishpacha are here, or you tell them I was calling Adam's name. And you're not supposed to, have favorites among your students. They're all your children. But really, Adam's one of my favorites. Okay? Anyway, so that being said. But now back to the fact that I have students, I think Adam knew what a typewriter was, but it gets further and further away from knowing this. But I come back to a period when I started out in newsrooms. We still had linotype operators actually on the first couple of papers I was on. We still wrote on manual typewriters in some of them. And when big news broke, what would happen is you would have something called a replate. I don't know if any of you ever worked in or around print shops, but you'd have the gigantic metal plates. Originally, they're kind of big slabs in which lead type had been set. Later, there are pieces of aluminum that would be done in a darkroom. They're photosensitive, and they'd be kind of bent onto the roller of a printing press. And so if big news happened, as the paper was already being printed, the hurricane hits, the election gets called, the Browns win the Super Bowl. Baruch Hashem to all of you. And any of those things, that's where that phrase "stop the press" goes. They would literally stop the press, and they would make new plates. And they would do what was called a replate. So like pull page one's plate off the press, put on the new page one, and resume the press run. So as a book author, though, in most of my books, I've resisted the idea of doing a replate. I always felt that whatever you write, in the time you write it, is what you have to live with for posterity. The one exception to that is Jew versus Jew, which is the one book that I've really felt a desire to go back and update in some way. I've been involved in a so far unsuccessful quest with my wonderful book editor, Alice Mayhew, to persuade her to do a new edition of Jew versus Jew. But in the absence of that, and I still hope it will happen, speeches like this give me the opportunity to update the book. And I don't mean updating in terms of going back to the specific narratives that I wrote about in the book, such as Beechwood or the Joint Conversion Program in Denver, or the, really trenchant, informed discussion in the Library Minyan, a conservative Havara in Los Angeles over the language of egalitarian language in the worship service and in the Siddur. Some of those have now become settled issues, some not. But my desire wasn't so much to go back and say, okay, here's, the postscript of what happened, although if Alice gives me the go-ahead, I probably will do some of that. It's more to talk about what's happened in the almost 20 years since Jew versus Jew came out. I came to Beechwood for the first time almost exactly 20 years ago, October of 1997, and the book came out in August of 2000, so 17 years since the book came out. And I want to talk about what's changed in some expected and unexpected ways in the American Jewish world, and to some extent the diasporic Jewish world since then. It also means having to come to terms in an intellectually honest way with what I got right, what I got wrong, what I foolishly omitted. So you can say this is the start of slichot for me. But I want to start out with one image, and I really should have done a PowerPoint for it today. It occurred to me too late that I could have brought these images with me, but I'll try to paint them as we go through with my mind's eye for yours. The first image is the image of a menorah, and it's a menorah that's up for auction at Sotheby's in New York, and it's a menorah that was once owned by Sammy Davis Jr. And I found out about that menorah at the time of the auction. It was after Sammy Davis Jr. had died, and some of his personal belongings were being put up for auction by his estate. And one of the objects was his menorah. And there was, I think, a floor. This is the way auctions go. You say you can't even bid unless you're willing to bid X dollars. I think the floor, was either $6,000 or $10,000 for his menorah. And I found it very poignant and kind of heartbreaking that no one bid the floor. And so the menorah was not sold. It had been a gift to Sammy Davis Jr., I think from a local branch of the National Council of Jewish Women, might have been Hadassah branch. And of course, it was in recognition of the fact that Sammy Davis Jr. became a Jew by choice. And not only that, Sammy Davis Jr. was a groundbreaking person in a lot of ways. And actually, the first really serious biography of him that's been done, I think, is due out this fall. I'm really looking forward to it because I felt that he's never really gotten his due, partly as a Jew, but in other ways as well. But Sammy Davis Jr. was a groundbreaking figure because he had an interracial marriage. He was married to the Swedish actress Mai Britt. But also what I did not realize is she also became a Jew by choice. And they had Jewish children who I believe were adopted. So in many ways, Sammy Davis Jr. was pointing to what was going to be an important part of Jewish life coming forward. And that's the emergence of the both Jews by choice, but also multiracial Jewish identity, which has been, I think, one of the most exciting and positive parts of the Jewish world. In Israel, very much because of the law of return, but also here in the United States. And it represents, I think, a situation in which, in this case, we can talk a lot more later about the chief rabbinate and the kotel and a lot of the really, by my lights, despairing news on that front. But this is one case in which religious tradition has been a radically progressive and inclusive force. And the reason I say that is I think for a lot of us in this room, being the descendants of Jews who came here primarily from Eastern Europe in that big bulk of inbound immigration from 1880 to 1924, when, per what we're seeing now, that was when the eugenicists and the racial supremacists of that time devised an immigration law to make sure Jews and also Italians and Asians didn't come here and pollute the racial stock of white America. But most of us came to this country, or our ancestors did, at a time when being Jewish was a matter of bloodlines and folkways. In fact, it's really amazing now that we're in this era of DNA analysis with Ancestry.com and 23andMe to often see how pure a lot of these Jewish bloodlines are. My son was the first one in my family to get his blood done, and when it came back 95% Eastern European Jewish, his sister, my daughter, immediately said, "Oh, Aaron, 95% Fiddler on the Roof." And it just shows remarkably, for many of us who identify as Jewish, who know we're Jewish, how pure the bloodlines are. The other part that's fascinating is through either volitional or forcible conversion later on. We have people who never knew they were Jewish who find out they have these significant, if not majority, percentages of Jewish DNA. One of my sisters-in-law, who thought she was Welsh, Irish, Dutch, Native American, found out no Native American, but 23% Jewish. And she's on a genealogical search for that now. But I digress a bit. My point is that we felt that we were Jewish because through matrilineal descent, we knew we came from Jewish bloodlines, and because we brought a set of folkways here with us, that to be Jewish, to be part of the tribe in this country, was not only to have the bloodline, but to eat certain foods. It was, to eat chopped liver, and tongue and shav. It was to speak Yiddish. It was to get certain jokes, to be in on the jokes of Woody Allen or Mel Brooks or Henny Youngman. By the way, those jokes are so old, Rodney Dangerfield and my students love them. Today, you can't believe the laugh you can get from a classroom of 25-year-olds when you say, yeah, it's like the guy who goes to the doctor and says, the doctor said I was sick, so I said, Doc, give me a second opinion. And he says, okay, you're ugly too. That one kills with 25-year-olds. In any case, and even a certain set of kind of labor union, social democratic left politics, and of course a relatively sacred form of Zionism. This is what it meant to be Jewish in this country. And in some ways we think of that as being sort of loosely progressive, as opposed to being, loosely conservative. But what it really meant is that there was no way in unless you knew the secret handshake, and there was no way in unless you had the bloodline. And it remained that way for a long time. And that actually what Sammy Davis was part of was a changing sense of what it meant to be Jewish, and a way in that would be explicitly religious, that was taking on the yoke of the mitzvot and studying and declaring one's desire to be part of the Jewish people, as of course Ruth did in biblical times. And what went with that also was the change in adoption, the ubiquity of adoption from abroad that we've seen. Jewish families, even those who have bloodline, tribal, secret handshake forms of Judaism, adopting children from wherever it might be, Romania, China, African-American children, children from the Caribbean, children from Chile, all kinds of different racial identities, and raising them as Jewish. I was deeply moved a few years ago when I went to a bat mitzvah for one of my daughter's classmates, who was a Chinese girl adopted by a Jewish couple in New York. And I guess sort of in her orphanage, the generic last name, like the Jones or Smith, was Fu. And so a bunch of girls who'd all been adopted from the same orphanage stayed in touch, and their parents stayed in touch over the years, and they called themselves the Fu sisters. And so at this girl Cece's bat mitzvah, all the Fu sisters came, several of whom had been raised by Jewish families and had become Jews themselves. And so it was this remarkable moment of seeing Jewish kids who had nothing in terms of bloodline, who were bringing in a totally different ethnic identity, different ways of being Jewish with them. And if you're familiar with the group Bechal Lashon, it's a really impressive group of multiracial Jews from around the country. One of their big centers is in the Bay Area of California. They also have a lot of presence in New York City. But these are people who have come to Judaism through adoption, through conversion, through interfaith or interracial marriages over the years, and are proudly part of our world. And for them, and this is the radicalism of tradition, it doesn't matter what they didn't have. It doesn't matter what they weren't born with. It doesn't matter that you may, put, gefilte fish and borscht in front of them and they may turn up their nose at it because it's not what they grew up with, or it's not what they had at their grandparents' houses, but that they're very much part of the world we're in as Jews now. And it's absolutely reflected in the experience we see in Israel with Ethiopian Jews, with Burmese Jews, with the Sabbath River Jews from India, with Jews from the former Soviet Union, a lot of whom ethnic, bloodline-wise and halachically did not arrive there as Jews, but have become as deeply Jewish as you can be, being in the Jewish state, fighting for the IDF, dying for their country, sometimes being the targets of terrorist attacks. And so this was something I absolutely didn't see coming when I wrote Jew versus Jew. And in this verbal replate, I think it's one of the most important and positive changes that we've seen. And it's also an indication that as we fret, as we always do, about what the numbers are and what's the future of the community going to be, and are we declining too steeply? You know, it's the Jewish postcard, start worrying, details to follow. These are some details that might be an argument somewhat against worry. So that's why I find Sammy Davis this kind of inspiring and yet heartbreaking figure, someone who was that prophet without honor in his own land, someone who got there too soon, so that it wasn't just sort of one movie star doing this. It was him really pointing a way towards something that was going to become very, very more common in the decades to come. The second image I'd give you from my mind's eye to yours is an image of an odd couple. And I don't mean Oscar and Felix from the Neil Simon play or the TV show or the movie. It's an image of two people, of Rabbi Avi Weiss, who comes out of the modern Orthodox world, and of course was one of the great campaigners for Soviet Jewry and to bring Nazi war criminals to justice and other such causes, and Ruth Messenger. And Ruth Messenger is someone who's very much from the secular Jewish left in New York City, who I think lived in a commune as a young woman, went on to be kind of one of the embodiments of Manhattan left liberal politics, had the very bad fortune to run against Rudolph Giuliani when Giuliani was at the height of his popularity in 1993 and was decimated in the mayoral election, and looked like really her career of public service was going to end in a kind of a public rebuke delivered at the polls. And somehow, and I don't know exactly how it happened, Avi Weiss and Ruth Messenger became buddies. They became besties. You might have thought in the language of the young they'd be frenemies, but no, they're besties. And two things happened. I think each of them was heading in an important direction individually, but the convergence, the confluence of their two lives, I think propelled two tremendously important developments in modern Jewish life. With Avi Weiss, it's been the emergence and the propounding of what he calls open orthodoxy. And it's taken on several forms. One is through the yeshiva that he helped found, YCT, which has really become the epicenter of modern orthodoxy now, and the creator of some of the most important young modern Orthodox rabbis going out into the world. As Avi Weiss saw Yeshiva University and REITs, its seminary, drifting to the right, and felt you're not going to be able to bring it back to where it had been in earlier days. You need to create something new. YCT has been that something new. And some of the rabbis who've come out of YCT have gone to established congregations. For all I know, some may be one in the Cleveland area. But also some of them have been part of this emergence of egalitarian Orthodox minyanim. Some of them were inspired by early experiments in Israel, Shir HaHadash, I think is his name, and others, like Darkei Noam in New York, have developed more recently. And these are congregations, minyanim, lay-led, that will use the Orthodox Siddur, that expect their congregants to live Shomar Shabbat, but that in different ways have divided up the worship leadership and the Torah honors in an egalitarian way. Most of them still have a mechitza. Sometimes it'll be a very low one. Sometimes it'll be a bit higher. But when you're on the bima, you can approach from either side. And again, it varies from minyan to minyan how the Torah honors are are divided. But this is change at the ground level. And I see the Minyanim attracting a lot of the best and the brightest of the kids coming out of day school and coming out of college with deeply committed Jewish lives. It's where they feel like they are now. What's pushed it even further, which Avi Weiss had an inspiring role in, but really has gone on largely through a woman named Sarah Hurwitz, is the development of women as de facto rabbis in the Orthodox realm. And you may have heard of Yeshiva Maharat, because Maharat is an acronym or a contraction that Avi Weiss came up with when he had this super talented young woman studying with him, Sarah Hurwitz, who took on a role in the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale, his shul, that was sort of rabbi in all but the final vowel. Rabbah was another of the titles he gave her, and it let her be a decisor, to have various leadership roles in the congregation. And rather than it being just one person, Sarah Hurwitz then became one of the leaders of a yeshiva that's developed young women going out with that title all around the United States and into Canada as well, and really pushing the envelope on this. What this portends for Orthodoxy as a movement remains to be seen. Will there be a moment when there's going to be a fracture in the Orthodox Union? We know that what Avi Weiss and Sarah Hurwitz has done has run afoul of the RCA, the Rabbinical Council of America, which is the Orthodox rabbinical organization. I don't know if we're going to see an effective fourth movement emerge, whatever you would want to call it, open orthodoxy or some other name, but the facts on the ground tell us it's already here, and that it's going to be increasingly here, and that it's one of the results of the explosion in serious religious and Judaic education for young women that really began in the 1930s. It really goes back to the Rav, to Joseph Soloveitchik starting Maimonides School in the suburbs of Boston and beginning to give equal Talmudic education to the women there. And there's a theory about radical social change, which is that it doesn't come out of deprivation, it comes out of rising expectations. And that those decades, those generations of women receiving those high quality educations, ultimately at then places like Pardes and Dorot and so forth, said, how are you going to keep a lid on aspiration? How are you going to say you can have the equivalent education to your brother, but you can't lead a congregation or a minyan? You can't read from the Torah the way he can. And in the long run, it becomes impossible to keep a lid on it. And that's what we're seeing now. And I'll bet a lot of your children and grandchildren have exposure or maybe are active participants in exactly these religious experiments. And again, it's a tremendously exciting moment to see. And I think that, I can't help but think that Avi Weiss's exposure to Ruth Messenger, someone who's very much a quintessential second wave feminist, had to have had some effect on him. In the other way, it's like they say about Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire, he gave her a class and she gave him sex, sex appeal. I don't mean sex per se, but sex appeal. That there's always this dynamic relationship. There's always this dialectic in which one gets something from the other. And I think for Ruth Messenger, the friendship with Avi Weiss deepened and I think revived a Jewish identity in a way that she had become, it had been dormant in her. I won't say she was ever estranged from it, but it was dormant because in fact, her mother had been very involved, and there was a long family history with Jewish Theological Seminary, but you never would have known for much of Ruth's life that that was a big part of her DNA, metaphorically speaking. And in knowing Avi Weiss, I think that got rekindled, the Pintele Yid, the Jewish spark, I think was reignited in her. And in this moment when it looked like her career was going to end in a kind of disgrace, she took on what looked like a, kind of last-ditch job, a salvage effort for a group called American Jewish World Service, which was almost moribund. It was like taking over a congregation that's down, to having trouble making the morning minyan, to say Kaddish. And Ruth took all of her experience in progressive politics, in social justice, in Tikkun Olam, and her renewed commitment to Judaism, and made American Jewish World Service a real phenomenon in the Jewish world. If you're not familiar with it, the best way to think of it is as a kind of a Jewish Peace Corps. And what it did was, I think, answer a question which secular Jews have had a hard time answering in the past, which is, it's not enough to say, you know, being in favor of social justice or being in favor of whatever it might be, immigration reform or economic equality or disaster relief. These are good Jewish values. Why? Because they're good Jewish values. That's sort of the answer you would get too often in the secular left-of-center Jewish world. I've always been haunted by this book I read a number of years ago about Jewish women in the civil rights movement. And it talked about some of them who'd gone down to Mississippi for Freedom Summer, and they had to learn about the Hebrew prophets, about Amos and Isaiah, you know, and Micah from Black Christians. Black Christians knew the Judaic roots of the civil rights movement better than the Jewish volunteers in many cases did. And I think that that was something that Ruth Messinger began to solve, was to say that American Jewish World Service, which sends Jewish young people out to work in a Peace Corps kind of way all around the world, mostly in primarily non-Jewish places, made it essential for them to be informed by Jewish learning along the way. So they had to know what they were doing was more than an amorphous answer to a vague sense of it's good as a Jew to do this. And if the follow-up question was why, they wouldn't have a viable answer to it. She began to provide an answer to it. And it's made that organization one of the, you know, really lightning rods in a good way of young American Jewish life. Now the question is, now that Ruth has retired from it, how will it do in its, you know, next leadership generation? And that again remains to be seen. We all know the experience of the congregation or the NGO that has a charismatic, compelling, committed leader. That person retires, and then what's the next, you know, what's the next leader like? We don't have that answer yet for American Jewish World Service, but I hope that it's going to be a positive one, because they've really pointed the way to other groups like Bend the Arc, if you are familiar with that group, that are also trying to engage young American Jews and say in a more meaningful, more thought through way what's Jewish about doing this work for social justice. Now, the next photograph would go to, the next image in this imaginary PowerPoint that I should have put together, but didn't, would be an image of the most unlikely rock star you've ever seen. And it would be an image of someone with a dark fedora and a really, really long beard. And I don't mean one of the guys from ZZ Top. This would be the Lubavitcher Rebbe. This would be Menachem Mendel Schneerson. And here's where, again, I feel like I completely missed the boat in Jew versus Jew. I don't know if I had the word Chabad in there. If it was rarely. And it's a major failing in retrospect of the book, because Chabad has been, since the 1960s, an answer to one of the burning questions for Jewish young people that I think begins in the 60s in the era of the counterculture, in the summer of love, when one of the Chabadniks of that time, Shlomo Karlebach, is setting up his house of love and prayer in Haight-Ashbury, right at the epicenter of the hippie movement, which is this search for authenticity. If you go back and read the Port Huron Statement, the founding document of the Students for a Democratic Society, even though it's written by an Irish Catholic, primarily Tom Hayden, there are a lot of Jews involved in it, like Todd Gitlin and others, and it raises a very Jewish question of the time, which is, what do we do with our comfort? Now the word would be privilege, but at that time they're talking about just the material comfort of growing up middle class. Where do we find meaning in our lives? You know, it's a different way of answering the question that Viktor Frankl raised in Man's Search for Meaning. His question was, how do you make meaning out of near extermination and apocalyptic tragedy? This was a question of how do you make meaning out of comfort and ease. And for a lot of young Jews of that era, and some of you may have gone through this kind of search or have maybe had siblings who did it. It took them into Native American religion. It took them into Buddhism. It took them, into communes. It took them into all these other places. It took them into radical politics. And the last place it seemed likely that they would find meaning would be in this version of Polish, Belarusian, Russian shtetl Jewry of the late 16th century and beyond. And yet, the Rebbe, someone who would seem the least attuned person to modern materialist, upper middle class, suburban Jewish life of mid-20th century America, ended up coming up with an answer to it, which was this answer of his version of authenticity. Great scholars like Ilana Cooper know that the concept of authenticity is always contested, that nothing is as authentic as it looks. And every time I see the Shasniks in Israel, these Jews from Morocco and Iraq walking around in the long coats of the Eastern European Hasidim, I say, yep, authenticity sure is a social construction. I don't think they were wearing that in Rabat and Baghdad. But nonetheless, the Rebbe had an answer, which is that to go back to something that seemed purer and less materialistic and more about the soul could answer some of these yearnings that began for Jewish young people in the 60s and that have persisted into this day. The other reason Chabad has been such a phenomenon, and the other really brilliant thing that the Rebbe did was, as we, too often, the Orthodox world and the Haredi world and the Hasidic world, although they're ready to welcome Baal Teshuvah, they're ready to welcome returnees to rigorous observance, the approach to it is either to require a very high bar to entry, basically to become Shomer Shabbat before you're really accepted, or to do the finger wagging, or to think that you can shame people into wanting to join you, which may work for some but doesn't work for most. The brilliant, subversive, in the best sense, idea that the Rebbe had is lower the bar to entry, make it easy. And it tied into his theology. Hasidic theology, as expressed by him, is that any mitzvah that's enacted by any Jew at any time, for any reason, brings Moshiach closer, brings the Messiah closer, brings the perfect world closer. So it actually doesn't matter if the person on a college campus who's approached, on the walkway to put it on to film or to wave the lulav and hold the esrog, if that person then goes on to have a ham sandwich at lunch. It doesn't matter if someone drives to the Chabad house on Shabbat, but then goes in to take an aliyah. That whatever happens is a good thing. And what the Rebbe also realized is that people will respond more to being loved and accepted than being judged and condemned. It seems like an obvious statement, but you'd be surprised at how rarely it's enacted. And here's the other thing that Chabad was brilliant at, and they remind me of good community organizers in this way, and remind me of the Mormons in this way. When he created the system of the shluchim, of the emissaries, generally married couples, who'd be sent all around to set up Chabad houses, he did two things. Number one, he made it, in the best way, competitive. He didn't send the schleppers and the losers out to the difficult jobs. You had to be the best of the best, just like the Mormons. If you're growing up in Utah and want to go on mission for the Mormons, you're like competing for the right to get sent to Mongolia, or Swaziland, or, Patagonia, the tough work. Tell me I'm good enough to do the tough work. And that was very much the Chabad way also. So the best people are chosen to be sent out all over the world. And the other thing Chabad did is they don't keep everyone on life support financially. They're staked to some money at the start, but basically the shluchim have to figure out, what does my community need? how do I provide it? And if you provide it, then the money will follow. But they're not on the drip, drip, drip of financial life support that can keep you doing the same thing that someone else is doing or the same thing you've done in the past, even if it does not work in the current setting. And that's why you see these amazing examples of, Chabad rabbis who, end up, snowshoeing or, doing dog sled races or doing anything that's endemic to the part of the country or the part of the world where they are, because they have to figure out what's needed. And it's made Chabad just a tremendous force in the Jewish world, including on campuses where it used to be, an unchallenged monopoly for Hillel. And I have no beef with Hillel at all, but even in my life at Columbia, where I'm on the faculty advisory board of Chabad, I've had to sit with the university chaplain and explain that when Hillel is complaining about Chabad, I said, look, Hillel is great, but we don't have a pope. No one gave Hillel a monopoly on Jewish life on campus. Anyone who can set up and provide services Judaically should be allowed to do it. And so Chabad's been, a phenomenon. And again, I wish I had paid closer attention along the way. And then I'll get to the last and most difficult thing, and then we'll open it up for questions. When I was writing Jew versus Jew, it was the summer of 1999. That's when I was actually composing the manuscript, and into the fall of 99. And that was when it looked like a peace deal really was going to happen between Israel and the Palestinians. There was very specific talk even about what suburb of Jerusalem, Abu Dis, was going to be the Palestinian capital, and how that was going to solve things. And the Palestinian Authority had its own, in effect, embassy in Jerusalem, a building called Orient House, and Jewish people would go to buy furniture in Bedia, in a West Bank city, where they could get well-made, inexpensive furniture, or they'd go to the casino in Jericho to gamble, or they'd hop a cheroot at the Damascus Gate and go up to a jazz club in Ramallah. I was there at that time. I was there the night that Ehud Barak defeated Benjamin Netanyahu to win the prime minister's election in '99, and it just looked imminent. And of course, that turned out to be surpassingly and tragically wrong. And we know what the outcome of that has been all these years down the road. But one of the most recent and I think heartbreaking developments of it has been a very clear alignment between Benjamin Netanyahu and the Republican Party, now Donald Trump, in this country. I'm not going to belabor this point. I know it's a bit of a third rail. I've written a lot about it, and you can find what I've written searching online, or if you're on Facebook, on my Facebook page. I don't hide behind any kind of a wall on that. But I think that the tremendous friction between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Obama, the very clear alignment over those years of the Israeli Prime Minister and his government with one party in this country and with one political movement, and what I would even say specifically in alignment with evangelical Christians, often at the expense of moderate and liberal Jews, has created the real crisis that we're in diaspora Israeli relations now. And the Kotel situation and the chief rabbinate situation is a part of that. A lot of people who are deeply committed Zionists, I certainly count myself as one, deeply committed Zionists have worried aloud. Steve Boehm from the American Jewish Committee, one of the smartest people in the world on diaspora Israeli relations, has been part of a think tank. He's headed it up within the AJC that's looked at these issues of religious pluralism and the damage that can be caused if they're not handled carefully. Natan Sharansky has been part of that same effort. We're not talking about people who come from anywhere near the far left. We're talking about people whose individual praxis is very much orthodox, centrist, or modern orthodox. Dov Zakheim, who was an official in the Bush administration. And what they've said is that the continued monopoly of the rabbinate over the kotel, over life cycle matters like marriage, divorce, conversion, burial, estranges the vast majority of American Jews from Israel. And it's driving away people who want to be supportive in the deepest way of the Zionist enterprise. It's even complicating the thinking of people who on security issues, the Iran deal, whether there's a peace process anymore, would be very sympathetic to and supportive of the current Israeli government, but feel pushed away on this basis. And again, this is an epic change. This is an epic change. The thing we used to worry about collectively is our identification with Israel too big a part of American Jewish identity? Do we depend too much on what seemed then like the very easy alignment we have with Israel to prop up our American Jewish identity rather than asking ourselves what, as American Jews, makes Judaism important to us? But suddenly, that problem seems like a luxury, and we're looking at a real combination of divide and disengagement. I mean, the divide we see now in terms of AIPAC versus J Street, and then next further on the left from J Street, if not now, and then further, way further than if not now, Jewish Voice for Peace, which is actively anti-Zionist. But particularly, I think the division between AIPAC and J Street is reflective of that. But what we also see, and you see it very much on college campuses where I've spent a good deal of my life, is the desire of many Jewish young people to just step away from this issue entirely, to feel that it's nothing they want to get drawn into conversation, much less public argumentation about. A very deep and profound anxiety about what they can say on behalf of Israel and the Zionist enterprise and the Zionist state to their classmates. I'm not defending that kind of paralysis, but I do have empathy for it, and I know some of the places from which it arises. And there was a fascinating column by J.J. Goldberg that went up on the Forward's website just in the last day or two, in which he talks about birthright, and he says one of Birthright's great successes has been introducing young people to Israel and making them feel attached to Israel, sort of reversing what's been this generational pull away from it. But he goes on to say, when you look at how those same young people are polled, though, on a lot of the Israeli government's actions, they're no more supportive of it than in fact, they're less supportive of it than the older cohorts. That they care for Israel, they know Israel, but they know it well enough to feel troubled by what some of the policies are and troubled by the gap that's opening up. Anyway, if I ever get to write the replated version of Jew versus Jew, I hope you'll think about buying it, even though you got all the spoilers now. But as I always say to my kids when they're talking about a movie, I say, don't worry, I'll still watch it, even if you tell me the spoilers. Anyway, thank you so much for your time, for this wonderful turnout, and welcome back.
And we'll invite you back when the book comes out, after we've had the spoilers. Yeah. I'd love to take questions from the audience for Sam.
And please, questions. I know whenever it's a Jewish audience, say not a statement. A question ends with a question mark.
A question that ends with a question mark.
Not an exclamation point.
Not so much a question, but asking you to react. Chabad, in the local Jewish news, announced 2 new Chabad houses, one at Kent State University and another, I've forgotten where, maybe at Chabad case. And in the article they talk about their hope to cooperate with Hillel. What's your reaction to that? And wait, I have a second question that is a reaction too. I read in one of the Jewish newspapers that there are a large number or a growing number of Gentiles who recognize 2-3 generations ago they had Jewish ancestors, and they're looking to recall their past and perhaps reunite. Just okay. Reactions.
Those are two great things. In terms of Chabad and Hillel, I'm really glad to hear that. You know, it really tends to go campus by campus. I know of campuses in which Chabad and Hillel have really good relations, cooperate a lot, and I wish it would be that way, because I always see it as a 1+1 thing, not a zero-sum game. You know, Columbia, unfortunately, didn't play out that way. So I think this is much better, because the other thing I would always say to the chaplain is the average Jewish kid isn't thinking, am I going to go only to Chabad or only to Hillel? They're thinking about, ooh, Chabad is doing, you know, jazz in the sukkah. I'm going to go there. And then there's this cool thing happening at Hillel 2 nights later. I'm going to go there. And it's, you know, needlessly invidious to feel like you're in competition. So, you know, it's 1 + 1 = 3 is the way it should be, and I'm glad to hear that. I find that a lot of it depends on the personalities involved. You know, what's the personality of the Chabad rabbi? What's the personality of the Hillel rabbi? Do people see each other as competitors, or can they get along with each other? So that's reassuring to hear. In terms of, remind me of the second one again? Oh, yes. Well, this is this amazing outcome of being able to do DNA testing, is that people, you know, are finding out. And obviously, as more people get tested, the database gets larger and larger, and the results will be even more specific where their actual ancestry comes from. And so it's not at all surprising to me that people who thought themselves to be non-Jewish and then find out they have some substantial amount of Jewish blood want to then reclaim that. The Washington Post had a really great story a couple of weeks ago, 2 or 3 examples of people who'd done DNA kits and had found out stunning things. And one of them was someone who thought she was Irish American. And it turned out that, I think it was a grandmother or grandfather, had been 100% Jewish and through some way had been adopted, maybe as an probably as an orphan, by an Irish Catholic family in Ireland, and, you know, was socialized that way, and that was the identity that this young woman who did the test had, and now her whole sense of herself was being drastically rethought. You know, it can cut both ways, or there are also probably people who are told, you know, you're all Jewish, you know, we're Jewish all the way, and are going to find out that they have non-Jewish DNA in the mix. So it can cut, you know, absolutely both ways. And then it's the question, of course, is DNA destiny or not, and why does it have to be? For some people, it gives meaning. People may say, I always felt I was Jewish, now I have proof of it. For others, it may be, that's interesting, but I've grown up, you know, in the Catholic Church. I feel attached to the church and its ritual and its doctrine, and it's fun to know I have a Jewish ancestor, but that doesn't change who I feel I am. Yes?
I'll bring the mic around.
When people in groups have deep feelings on an issue or a way of life or whatever it may be that are so fundamental to them and to their life, on both sides, like in the Civil War, it exploded. What do you think is going to happen in Israel, and for that matter in America, when these two sides feel so deeply about their positions that they're not going to change much at all? Is it going to be an explosion, or is it going to be something else? And if it's something else, what do you think it's going to be?
Well, I don't know if it'll be an explosion, but I think you're seeing, you know, a dangerously wide opening between the majority of American Jewry and Israel's state policy particularly on the pluralism issue, because even more, I think, than the security issue, that one feels like a rejection of people's committed Jewish lives here. And I think that it was, you know, a short-term solution for the prime minister to keeping his coalition together, to, you know, to renege on the Kotel plan. But people in his own midst, Sharansky, you know, people who are pro-settler security hawks like Naftali Bennett, wanted that Kotel plan to move forward. You know, partly because the modern Orthodox in Israel and a you know, substantial chunk of the settlers are modern Orthodox, are affected by the same kind of movements of open orthodoxy and egalitarianism that we see here, and aren't rigid as you might imagine from a distance on these ideas of pluralism and egalitarian worship. Some of them, as Olim, have come from other countries in which non-Orthodox Judaism is the numerical majority. And so they don't have that sense of this is an alien thing, this is some weird, you know, mutant form of Christianity, you know, which is what you hear the chief rabbinate basically saying about reform, you know, and conservative Judaism. And so they understand the risk of, you know, for the sake of holding on to a momentary coalition, having a long-term estrangement. I mean, when you have major donors, I can't remember the fellow's name, but this fellow from Florida who gave $1 million donations to institutions in Israel and was a big supporter of AIPAC, so this is a right-of-center guy saying, I'm not giving any more money to Israel until this gets fixed. You know, the Kotel issue, that's a gigantic problem, and I don't understand why, you know, everyone says what a terrific strategic thinker the prime minister is, but there's a difference between tactical thinking and strategic thinking, and I don't understand what kind of strategic thinking would you know, choose, again, a momentary coalition against this kind of a rift. You know, when the reform movement says we're not going to have dinner with the prime minister, something big is going on. So I think even more than the security issue, that's the issue that absolutely has to be fixed. And I understand, historically speaking, and I wrote about it in Jew versus Jew, that back at the founding of the state, most of the Orthodox world was anti-Zionist. They said there can't be, you know, Zion without the Moshiach. You had a small part of the Orthodox world, you know, the national religious, that was willing to be Zionistic, you know, embodied by people like the Rav and the elder Rav Kook. And Ben-Gurion said, we got to have some allies in the Orthodox world. What do we give them? You know, it's political horse trading, which is fine. If, you know, if you'll really support the state and be part of it, we'll let you run life cycle and ritual and religious sites. That was the right answer at the time. Ben-Gurion also thought the Orthodox were going to die out, being the good secular socialist he was. He was obviously very wrong about that. But the other thing I always say, I would argue back to is, okay, that was the move then. Why is that inviolate? That's law. It's not natural law. It's not even halakha. In this country, it would be like saying, well, when we formed the Declaration of Independence, we said women don't have the vote. We said non-whites don't have the vote. So how could we ever change that? We did it. You know, of course not. You say at a certain point, conditions change, ideas move forward, and you adapt. And it didn't destroy the American Republic to give the vote to women and to non-whites. And I think, why wouldn't that be true in theory in Israel as well on, you know, on this issue? There's so much to lose if it's not rectified. Yes, on the aisle there.
It disturbs me to see Jewish students, pro-Israel Jewish students, and speakers being intimidated on college campuses. And this is coming from anti-Zionists, including Jewish Voices for Peace and BDS supporters. And it also bothers me that that administrators seem not to support the Jewish students and cave into the anti-Zionists. And I would just like to see what your response is to that.
You know, I can't speak to every example of that. I certainly know that there are really egregious examples. You know, one when Michael Oren, then ambassador, was speaking at UC Irvine. There was one involving Moshe Halbertal when he was speaking at the University of Minnesota. And I think that, you know, I think the responsibility for university administrators is to protect, you know, is to protect free speech as long as it's not hate speech on college campuses. But I also have to say that and this is a bigger issue than just how Jewish students feel, but that the responsibility of a college student is to get out of their comfort zone and to be willing to be discomfited. For a lot of people on the left of my generation, it's weird to see the left of our students' generation, because our idea of going to college was intellectual combat and a lot of argumentation. And that was, you know, stimulating to us. It was part of the college experience. The idea that one would go to college not to be challenged on whatever the issue is seems to be a product of a much more recent generation. And so I'm sympathetic to the discomfort of individuals, Jewish students. I mean, my daughter, when she was at Vassar, which has had a lot of pro-BDS activity, you know, talked to me about, you know, what it was like to go to the bathroom and sit in the bathroom stall and see, you know, Israel apartheid graffiti, you know, marked on the door. So I understand it, you know, very much as a parent, but I also think Jewish students need to be equipped to push back, to argue, to advocate, and not to hope that the adults, meaning the university administrators, are going to be the ones to say this isn't allowed or that isn't allowed. I mean, I also think that every time there's an example of this, it gets very widely reported. The huge amount of campus life, you know, Jewish campus life, left-wing activist campus life, for that matter, right-wing activist campus life, that goes on without someone being shouted down or boycotted doesn't really get written about. You know, in my life at Columbia over many years, I've heard Columbia so routinely described as a terrible place for Jewish students to go. And it's so untrue, and it gives me, even as someone in the media, a real wariness of what, you know, is put out about there. Columbia's Jewish population is somewhere around 30%. I think Barnard is more like 40. We have a proud Barnard and Columbia alumna right up here. In Olana, you know, you see kids all around walking with their kippot, walking with their tzitzis out. If there was a reign of terror at Columbia, you know, you sure wouldn't expect to see it. And this coexists with Israel Apartheid Week happening right in the middle of the Quad. And I think that's fine. I don't agree with Israel Apartheid Week, but I think let Jewish students advocate on the other side of it. The answer isn't that you shut down Israel Apartheid Week because it makes Jewish kids feel temporarily uncomfortable. That's not going to prepare you for going out into the rest of your life. And it's true on a whole bunch of issues. The Israel activism and BDS piece is just one piece among very, very many. Now, I'm going to do an interesting thing. I'm teaching journalism ethics this fall. Great time to be doing it. I'm so psyched about it. And journalism students overall, I think, especially we've only grad students, so they're older, they had more life experience, but also they're part of what journalists do is, you know, hear other opinions and take them in. But I'm doing an interesting thing. There's a guy who's the editor-publisher of the daily paper in Hillsboro, Ohio, down sort of in the Dayton, Cincinnati area, who his paper was one of, I think, 3 in the whole country to endorse Donald Trump for president. And he's written a lot of really compelling columns about how he thinks the coastal media doesn't understand the rest of the country. So I said, how do you like to talk to a couple of ethics classes at Columbia? So we're going to do it. He's going to Skype in the first 7 weeks when I'm teaching an evening session, and I'm flying him in for a daytime session for more students the second part of the semester. And it's going to be really interesting for me. I don't know how students are going to react to it. I hope they're going to listen to him and be respectful. But it's going to be an interesting litmus test for, can you hold that much difference in your, in your brain and not try to omit it and not try to shout it down. Yes, in the front here.
Thank you very much. We're fortunate to have a guest sociologist coming to the university, Philip Wexler, who wrote a book called Mystical Sociology. Okay. After a career in academics in the US, he went to Israel to study Jewish mysticism. Wow. And his point is, if I understand it, that he believes that mysticism is a cultural force also in ascendancy, and that the interface between mysticism from a number of traditions, and only Jewish traditions, is something to consider in our conversation that we're having today about the future of these various interrelationships. Would you comment on mysticism and its evolution?
That's a great question. I'm really kind of out of my area of expertise here, so I don't want to say too much, but it strikes me that he's on to something, because you see in the Jewish world attachments to mysticism in different ways. I mean, there's certainly this boomlet of Kabbalah study, or, at least Kabbalah wannabeism, because of course in real, traditionally Kabbalah was the thing you did at the end. You didn't just sort of leap into it because it is so mystical. But there's that. I think these, I think Chabad touches some of this for sure. And sometimes it can go into a dangerous place because, as you know, there's a split in the Lubavitcher world between those who actually think the Rebbe is the Moshiach, and those who don't. So it can go, as much as I admire Chabad, into some problematic places, but also the so-called Jew-boos. You've heard these terms, Jews who have many elements of Buddhism, Jew-boos, and also Hindus, Jews who are kind of amalgamating their practice with Hindu elements. So I think that's part of it. And look, the overall New Ageism that's out there, it's not just a Jewish thing. We're part of also these larger strains in religious culture. And so that whole phenomenon is distilled in the bumper sticker, I'm not religious, I am spiritual. That's, I think a lot of that's sort of a million miles wide and about a quarter-inch deep, but that's just me. But that idea that New Ageism of all sorts that we see in the broader culture. So it's there, and there are all kinds of answers to modernity. There are answers to modernity. Modernity is hard. Modernity is vexing. Rationality doesn't give me the answers to many of the existential questions. And some people find answers in a more kind of denominationally based, congregationally based religious practice, and others do it in a more amorphous, spiritual / mystical way. The great sociological note on this comes from the book Habits of the Heart by Robert Bellah, eminent sociologist at UC Berkeley for many years. And it came out in the mid-90s, but it's a really trenchant book. And he talks about a woman who describes her religion as Sheilaism. Because her name is Sheila, and she's like, I believe in this, I believe in that, I believe in this third thing, and I call it Sheilaism. And anyway, okay, right here in the center.
Completely different question. I'm just marveling at how much you read, how aware you are of current writers, the Washington Post, the Forward, any blogs, your awareness of current campus issues, you're a writer. You organize an ethics class which doesn't come out of nowhere. How do you find the time?
I don't know. I feel like I have a pretty normal life. I always look at, I always like when David Remnick writes his amazing pieces in New York, it's like, man, Remnick, it's like you edit the magazine, you do this really good podcast, and then you write these 10,000 word articles, do you sleep? So there's always like someone else who you're looking at and saying, how do they do it? I have a friend who's so much younger named Pharrell Evans. He's like 40 years old, and everything I've read, he already knows. It's like, I was like, Pharrell, like you were such a polymath. In fact, this is interesting, talk about multicultural Judaism. So Pharrell is African American. He has two cousins who, one of whom grew up in an ancestrally black Jewish family, and I think lives in Teaneck or Tenafly, modern Orthodox, and another one who is a Jew by choice and who converted, married, got divorced, remarried, and is now living in Israel. But anyway, so I look at like everything I mentioned Pharrell has read. So I don't know. I mean, I try to hang on to what I have had. Certainly being a journalist compels you to try to stay current. And when you have students, the great thing is you're constantly learning from your students. You're constantly being turned on to things by your students, and you know, and having a couple of very aware and alert children helps too. So thank you.
We'll take maybe one or two more.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I haven't been over in this part of the room in a while. Yes.
Going back to the split between the Israeli leadership and American left-wing Judaism, it strikes me that a parallel with a situation in Canada that I was aware of 40 years ago. Jewish people living there. Do you want to go to the Protestant school or the Catholic school? No, I want to go to the Jewish school. Sorry, do you want to go to the Protestant school or the Catholic school? It's a kind of rigidity that's not responsive at all. Comment?
No, I mean, just, you know, if we were on Facebook, I'd put a like on it. I mean, I didn't know about that whole history. I would, if I had that choice, so I'd go to the Catholic school in a minute. But I always say I'm a Philo-Catholic, and a priest I know says it's better than Philo-Dough. Okay, we can do one more.
Okay, and I have a final question too.
Yeah, you get the last one.
Okay, all right. So I'll take the final question. It's sort of like a meta question. Your first book, Jew versus Jew, not your first book, but your first book that's sort of under discussion here, Jew versus Jew: The Struggle for the Soul of American Jewry, really focuses on struggles in American Jewry between sort of different perspectives, different ways of being American, different ways of being Jewish. And your talk today didn't, until the end, we got into some tense issues. You're starting with Sammy Davis Jr., you're talking about the buddy, best friendy relationship between Avi Weiss and Ruth Messenger, really focused on wonderful new, in your estimation, wonderful new open trends in American Judaism. And I just wonder if you do have the chance to do a second book, would you intentionally go that route as opposed to the struggle route? And are you trying to say something with that?
Well, no, that's a really great question. I think that, I think part of what's happened, to answer in a meta way, is that some of the issues that looked like they were going to be major fractures, for instance, egalitarian worship, or even something that emerged after I finished the book, but, you know, LGBTQ Jews, those things for really all of the American Jewish world, from modern Orthodox all the way to unaffiliated, are pretty settled issues. Now, there would still be some distinction between how centrist and Haredi orthodoxy would view certainly egalitarian worship, you know, and what's the word? Affirming, you know, gay affirmation being affirming. They'd view that differently, less positively than everyone from modern orthodoxy on would. But I also feel like actually, even in that part of the Jewish world, you don't have, let's say, take the LGBTQ part of it first, the vicious rhetoric and action that's characteristic among fundamentalist Christians. You know, it may not be a public embrace, but for the most part, even in the, you know, those other parts of the Jewish world, there of course are individual exceptions and aberrations, but even there's not the hatred, the dehumanization that's pervasive on the Christian right. So I think that some of those issues, you know, and because of things like Maharat and YCT, some of the issues of praxis have really tended to resolve themselves. And I think some of it is also because we are in an increasingly post-denominational age when institutional power is diminishing. It's not vanishing the way some scholars would argue, because it's hard to replicate the way a denomination will have its seminary, its university, its summer camp, its publishing house, its congregational organization. You can't just sort of snap your fingers and make that in a non-denominational way. But nonetheless, I think lived Jewish life is a lot more fluid now than it's been, and I think that takes some of the pressure off. I can't tell you, talking about Chabad, how many people I met when I went around speaking about Jew versus Jew. You fly into town, someone picks you up at the airport, you're chatting with them. How often someone would say, oh, I belong to two shuls. I go to the Reform Temple and I go to Chabad. That was common. And so I think that also is a healing and ameliorative part. But I think that what I thought, as I said, would have been one of the key binding forces, Israel identification, in three ways. Security, is there a peace process? Politics, the Netanyahu alliance with the Christian right and the Republican Party, and now Trump. And third, pluralism. Those are now the real inflection points, and severe ones, really severe ones. Anyway, thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you so much.